Good evening. I am so happy to be here this week so that we can talk about the latest episode of the ARK-aeology Files. But before we begin, I just want to take a moment and bow our heads and have a word of prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for being with us this week. Thank you for letting all of the technology work so that we can share and study about your word together. In your name we pray, amen. Well, if you were with us last week, you were expecting this program. There was some technical glitches, but hopefully we've got them all sorted out. So I am so excited to share with you this week about the Red Sea crossing and Mount Sinai. We do have a lot of information to cover, so we might not get to all of it this week, but we can always conclude this program next week. So let's dive right on in. Previously, we had talked about the plagues and Israel in Egypt, and then we've got the plagues. They're leaving Egypt. They're on their way out, and this is one of the best known Bible stories. It's right up there with Noah and Jonah and Daniel, and it is the Red Sea crossing. And as they're leaving Egypt, they're going to have to cross this sea. God is leading them. They're headed to a place called Mount Sinai. And this is where a lot of people start to have some disagreements. Because when we are talking archaeology, there's not a lot of archaeological evidence that can be found in the Sinai Peninsula that would support a group of individuals, a very large group, wandering around there for 40 years in the wilderness. So the question becomes, is this actually Mount Sinai? This is the most famous depiction of Mount Sinai. It's right there where we have something that's also called St. Catherine's Monastery, and it's in the Sinai Peninsula. So a lot of people are convinced that this is where Moses fled from the Pharaoh. This is where the Israelites went to worship God. But the question is, how did this become Mount Sinai, and how does this lead up to the Red Sea crossing? Well, first off, is this actually Mount Sinai? Because it got its name from actually Constantine's mother. Constantine had a dream. He described it to his mom. His mom went on this trip to find all of these religious sites, and she sees this mountain and says, "Oh, this is great. This is what my son described." And all of a sudden, we have this new tradition. The question is this a reliable source? Would this withstand the scrutiny of science and biblical history? So the question becomes, is Mount Sinai on the Sinai Peninsula, or is it in Arabia? So I'm going to give you all a minute to work out your answer. A for Sinai Peninsula or B for Arabia. You can pop that in the comments box. You can think about it and say, okay, am I right? Am I wrong? If you have any other questions during the program, please feel free to pop those in the chat box. So glad to see everything is working well this weekend too, Heaven Soon. Thank you very much for attending this evening. Glad to have you here. Okay, so hopefully you've got your answer on whether you think that Mount Sinai is in the Sinai Peninsula or whether you think it's in Arabia, because we're going to see what the Bible has to say about this, because it's very pivotal for any conversation that we're having on the Red Sea crossing or the wanderings in the wilderness, which is basically almost all of the books of Moses. We can find our answer in Galatians 4:25. So I hope you said that it is B in Arabia, because when we read Galatians 4:25, it says, "For this Agar is Mount Sinai in Arabia." Now, let's not just look at one location. Let's look at multiple locations in the Bible. So turn to Exodus 2:15 and Exodus 3:1. Now, this might be a little familiar because this is talking about Moses fleeing Pharaoh. Moses is 40 years old and he commits an act that we'll get to in a little bit, but he ends up fleeing Egypt and he goes to dwell in the land of Midian. And in the land of Midian, he is a shepherd and he is guiding his father-in-law Jethro's flocks. And as he's guiding these flocks, he ends up at Horeb, which is called the Mountain of God, otherwise known as Mount Sinai. Let's look at where the Midianites actually lived. The Midianites did not live over here in the Sinai Peninsula. The land of the Midianites is known archaeologically and anthropologically to be actually over here beneath the land of Edom. So when Moses is fleeing, he basically has two routes to take. You might be familiar with this route map because this is what we were looking at when we're talking about Joseph and which route he was sent to Egypt on. So this is just that same trip in reverse, except for the fact that Moses did not take the northern route. Moses took the fastest way out of Dodge. He went down the southern route, which went directly towards Saudi Arabia into the land of the Midianites. And this should have been a very easy trip for the Israelites because this was a well-established route. There were roads. You weren't going to be just sinking in the sand. The sand is compact there, makes it very easy to travel, should not have taken them hardly any time at all. So what went wrong? If we're trying to get to Mount Sinai here, the road obviously does not go through any sea. So what is happening? The reason that they end up in the sea, and just how does this relate to Mount Sinai? If you look in the back of your Bibles, now if the Bibles are newer, they might not have these maps. They might have some notations elsewhere, but most of the Bibles prior to, I'm going to say 2010, this is what you're going to be looking at. And I want you to take a moment to review these 4 images and see if you can spot any issue with the traditional map routes. When you are looking in the back of your Bible at these maps that they have conveniently provided to show you where all of the wildernesses are that the Israelites went through and the places that they stopped and where the mountains are located and the route through the Red Sea, what is the one fact that is missing from these maps? If you said, there's no Red Sea crossing, you're correct, because as we are looking at these maps, you can take a closer look. I'm going to zoom into a map here. There is actually no location on these maps where they place the Red Sea crossing. And that's because it is so contested in most historians' viewpoints that they actually won't even put it on a Bible map. We have a Bible story, a Bible map, and because they're afraid of the backlash, they will not put in a Red Sea route. Whether it be at the wrong location or the right location, at least they could take the effort. When we are looking at this map, we also have to consider that there are several verses where it talks about the Israelites being led out of the land of Egypt. We see this in Exodus 6:13 and in Exodus 13:16. There's a variety of other locations throughout the Bible where it talks about the Israelites leaving the land of Egypt. And when we are looking at the maps of what consists of modern Egypt and ancient Egypt and the territories that Egypt controlled, what is the one thing that you notice on these maps? The thing that I notice the most in these maps is that they all show the Sinai Peninsula as being under Egyptian control. We know that at some points the Egyptians did make their way up into Israel, and we see that being battled out in the books of Kings and Chronicles. But that was very briefly. They didn't totally control it, and the Israelites maintained their control of the land of promise. But in all of the cases that we are looking at these maps, the Sinai Peninsula is always in Egypt's territory, fully controlled by them. So God led them out of the land of Egypt so that they could wander around there for 40 years. That really doesn't make sense. When we are looking at some of the archaeological evidence, I want to point out mine that they have found some evidence in. So this is the traditional, this blue star represents the traditional location for Mount Sinai there at the St. Catherine's Monastery. But if we go northwest, we're going to look at this turquoise mine. That is this yellow star right here. This is going to be the Serabit El-Khadim mine. And when we are looking at this mine, we can see where the workers of this mine lived, their worship. We see an ongoing battle between the worshipers of the cattle goddess Hathor and people actually inscribing on the mine walls to the god El. They're begging for salvation from being worked as slaves in this turquoise mine. And so we see this clash between the cattle god and the actual God of the universe. We see a mix of individual beliefs that are there, and we see people working as slaves in this mine asking for salvation. So why would God free them from this oppressive nation that has got them in rule and then have them wander around the same area? That's not being free. That's still being captive within this area and still surrounded by the influences of these false gods. If we go to look inside of these mines, these are some of the inscriptions. They've been translated by a variety of people, but researcher Michael Baran, he specifically has looked at a couple. This one is image or inscription 357. It's very faint. You can see the inscription very faintly along here. You can best see the W for the water lines here. And then it goes across the bottom here. And then this is what they've been able to write down from this inscription so that you can actually try to read it. When he is looking at this inscription, the inscription actually says, this is Moses, or this is from Moses. If you go to another inscription in this area, this is another way of looking at this same one, specifically highlighting the phrase, this is from Moses. If you wanted to go through and learn more about Moses and his writing the Bible and looking at some of these inscriptions and engravings, I do highly recommend one of the Patterns of Evidence DVDs called The Moses Controversy. It has a lot of excellent research and information in there. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of these different inscriptions, like this inscription. This is inscription 361. You can see it in the upper right-hand corner here. And again, here is the illustrated version of this. And it is literally says, a saying of Moses. We know that Moses was familiar with the people. He wasn't unknown to them. He lived in Egypt as a king's grandson and potentially the next ruler for 40 years. And after he came back, they had at least 3 to 6 months for the plagues to happen while they were still in bondage. So finding inscriptions in a mine that are highlighting Moses' name and begging for salvation, those are not going to be unlikely. In fact, we would expect to see something like this because the people know that, hey, the time is almost up. We're waiting. We know that Moses has been designated as our person that we're looking to for rescue. So we're going to say some of his sayings, we're going to promote his name, and we're going to call upon God using the name of Moses in hopes that we're going to find some salvation. So if we are looking at Mount Sinai, aka Horeb, aka the mountain of God in the land of Midian, then how come nobody has ever pointed this out before? How come the maps are all wrong? Why has it taken so long for people to realize that Mount Sinai isn't in the Sinai Peninsula? Because don't we have places that tell us where it is in the Bible? Surely there's other locations, and we do have other locations. So Pi Hahiroth, Migdal, Baal Zephon, these are all places that are mentioned as locations that were passed in the Exodus that the Israelites had to go through. One means the mouth of the gorges, other means a tower, other means Lord of the North. Well, we see where the Baal worship that's coming from Canaan. So these are locations, but there are also multiple places that are, say, called Migdal. So they don't point out any one specific location, but it does give us an idea of the type of location that we would be looking for a Red Sea crossing. So we know that the Red Sea crossing is associated with a location that has something similar to gorges, or would have a lot of gorges nearby, that there is a tower, a watchtower, or some type of wall that would act as a barrier or a lookout point. We know that it's going to be someplace where they're near Baal worship, or near an area where there's a Canaanite influence. A lot of people might say, hey, you know, there's this thing called the Great Bitter Lake, and didn't they cross here? Well, one, if you read in Exodus 14:3, Pharaoh says that they're entangled in the wilderness and they can't escape. The wilderness has shut them in, so they can't really escape. When we are looking at Great Bitter Lake as it sits today, we're not seeing a lot of wilderness here. In fact, it's quite open, it's flat, there's lots of places for them to go. Over here towards the east, it's a little deserty, but there's still a lot of places to go. And the fact that back then, this lake actually possibly didn't exist. We know it didn't exist in this form. Great Bitter Lake, as we see today, this is a satellite image. You'll notice how there's these lovely, perfectly lined rivers. This is actually the Suez Canal, and the Great Bitter Lake that we are seeing today came into existence in 1869 when the canal was built. Prior to this, it was in a salt marsh area, and a lot of times it was dry. There was nothing there when the Nile flooded, and the various branches of the Nile that the area of Goshen or the Nile Delta is famous for. Some of them may overflow and get some of those spring rains. This area might fill up with water, not very deep at all, and you might get some marshy type land there, but you're not going to see it surrounding anybody and entrapping anybody. It would be quite easy to cross. The ancient Great Bitter Lake, they say, oh, this is the Reed Sea, the Marsh Sea, the Yam Suph, where the Israelites crossed. But the Egyptians didn't call it this name. They called it Kimwer, which actually means the great black one or the great black bull. So we do see bull worship here, which could be associated with the goddess Hathor, but we're not seeing it called anything associated with reeds or papyrus, which the Hebrew word would seem to indicate being called Reed Sea. And Yam Suph is actually the Greek translation of the Hebrew word. So we're not seeing the Egyptians associate this with reeds. And we know that it was not something that was there all year round. It was very localized, not something that you could see drowning an entire Egyptian army. If that was the location, then it's a miracle because God was able to drown the entire Egyptian army in about 3 inches of water. So that would be a miracle in itself, but we're not seeing the description of gorges, a watchtower, the wilderness shutting them in. It doesn't match any of these descriptions. Now, when it comes to Suph, there's a discrepancy because a lot of the languages back then did not use vowels. They only used the consonants when they were writing. And when it came to the Suph versus Soph, that is a vowel sound. And the vowel sounds were not written until 1,000 years after the event. So if you're not familiar with what vowel sound was being used, you could easily substitute the U for the O. And in the case of the Suph versus Soph, it is hypothesized that they actually did not mean Suph, that they actually meant Soph. Now, Soph would have a much better ending, and when you look at the Strong's Concordance and several of the commentaries and speakers of Hebrew, when you are looking at this particular word, even taking into account different vowel endings, another rarer translation for this word actually means end. And if you go with the Soph ending, it totally means end. The sea of the end, the sea of the destination, the terminating point. That makes a whole lot more sense than the sea of rushes. Now, why would that make more sense? A sea of the end? What does that mean? It's 1, the end of the Red Sea. 2, it's the terminating point of their time in a land that wasn't theirs. It was supposed to be the terminating point of their stay in Egypt, going into the next time period, ending the 400 and the 430 years. But there's also this little place at the very end of the Gulf of Aqaba that is called Ezon Geber. And this location is mentioned in 1 Kings 9:26, where King Solomon is making a navy of ships in Ezon Geber in the Yam Suph. So would King Solomon, the wisest man ever, build an entire navy of vessels in a little tiny lake that is dry for most of the year and has no connection to any point of the Mediterranean or the Red Sea? Or would King Solomon build his navy where it's sitting in a more sheltered area on the edge of one of the fingers of the Red Sea? And we know that he chose the Red Sea location because Ezon Geber sits next to another city called Eliath, which is at the very, very tip. It's at the northernmost point that you can get on the Gulf of Aqaba. So based on the definition and the use of this word in 1 Kings 9:26, we can tell you that when it's referring to Yam Suph, it's referring to the Gulf of Aqaba. We also see this in Numbers 21:4, where the people of Israel journeyed from Mount Horeb by way of the Red Sea to compass the land of Edom. That means that they were going around the land of Edom. Where is the land of Edom? Is the land of Edom over here, or is the land of Edom over here? Right where we have modern day Jordan at the end of the Dead Sea. And we know that ancient land of Edom is over in this location. So the Israelites in Numbers had to come down around by the way of the the Red Sea to come up and go around Edom. We also see this as the boundary or the terminating point of Israel, where they were going to the Sea of the Philistines, down to the Red Sea, and then back up to the Dead Sea. This was their boundary marker. And then in Deuteronomy 1:40, we see where they were ordered to go back to this same area after the spies report. Remember, Joshua and Caleb wanted to go into the land, and they brought back those fantastic sounding grapes that were like the size of your fist. And the other spies are like, no, we can't do this. And so that ended up being that they were condemned to wander in the wilderness for the 40 years. Did they have to go back to this location, or did they have to go all the way back over here into Egypt to a reed sea somewhere over in this area in the salt marshes of the land of Goshen where they used to live? They were sent back to this land over here. So that means that the Sinai Peninsula is very far from where they actually spent 40 years wandering, which makes sense why a lot of biblical archaeologists cannot find any evidence of the Israelites wandering around the wilderness for 40 years because they're looking in the wrong location. You could look here for an entire lifetime. You'll never find it because that is not where they were. They were over here in Arabia. And if you go over to Arabia, you can actually find evidence of that. And we will be looking at that later in this program. So now the question becomes, where did they cross the Red Sea in the Gulf of Aqaba? One of the proposed locations is that they came down this direction around the coast, up through here and across the straits here. That theory does not hold a lot of weight because, one, they would not have been entangled in the land, because as the Pharaoh's army was coming down here to get them, they could have circled back and into these wadis or these gorges and easily escaped. There was nothing that was preventing them from doing that. So they did have an exit option. We don't see any evidences for watchtowers or cities along the coast here that they would have been passing along the way that match the locations that are mentioned in the Bible. However, there is a location further up the coast that does match the biblical descriptions on every point, and that is Nuweibaa Beach. So when you are looking at the Gulf of Aqaba, we know that they didn't cross up here. There's no place that matches a description that would be something where, hey, the wilderness shut them in and there's watchtowers and there's nowhere for them to go. That just doesn't match what we know of the crossing site. But if you are going towards Nuweibaa Beach, there's this path, and look at these mountains. There is a wadi or a gorge that you can come down. It's rather large, but the mountains themselves, you might get one or two people up the sides of these if they're really motivated, but you are not going to take herds and flocks and large groups of people up these mountains. Once you're inside of this gorge, that's it. You are stuck there. And why do I say that you're stuck at this gorge? Couldn't you just get on the beach and walk up the beach? Because when you are looking at this area, the mountains come right up to the beach and then they go into the water. There's nowhere you can go. The mountains literally cut off your escape point. And then once you reach this particular location, this bend, this is your decision point right here. Once you are in the gorges, and this matches the mouth of the gorges description. There's a lot of gorges that come off of here, lots of wadis. But once you are at this wadi in particular, once you take this path, you are committed. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. You must go either to the beach or back to this point, and there was nowhere else for them to go. And we have to have a location along this entire area that is large enough to actually hold the number of people that are coming out of Egypt. And what are we talking as far as the number of people that would have been there? So if you look in Numbers chapter 1 and chapter 2, it gives us a list of individuals that came out of Egypt. These are males that were ages 20 and up. Specifically, it says that they were of war age. And if you look at Leviticus 27:32, it indicates that males of war age were from age 20 to 59. It says 60, but then if you read on further, it talks about offerings, and 60 was the limit where you were actually considered an elder and your offering number was decreased because you were considered an elder. So when we are looking at these numbers, we are talking the males who were between the age of 20 to 59, 20 to 60, and that's 603,000. We're just going to go with averages here. Notice that the tribe of Levi is not listed because Levi they were separate from everybody else. God had a very specific purpose for them. If you wanted to look at the numbers of Levites, we're talking somewhere probably around 46,000. So if you wanted to add, 46,000 to this, feel free to do so. But using population estimates for ratios, typically males and females, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. When it comes to children, so those 0 to age 19 or 20, it's a ratio of 1 child to every 2.5 adults. When we're looking at the ratio of adults to elders, that is a 4-to-1 ratio. So using those modern ratio estimates, we can get a modern estimate of, hey, if there are 603,000 men, then there's also going to be around 603,000 women. That means that as far as children go, we're going to be looking at somewhere of 241,000 kids for males, 241,000 for females. And then for elders, we're looking at somewhere around 301,000. In addition to the Levites and in addition to the mixed multitude. But if we adjust those ratios slightly based upon some of the evidence that we have from the ancient estimates, we end up with a male to female ratio in Egypt of 3 females to every 1 male. And why would we see that? Take a minute, think about that, pop that in the question box of why you think we would see a ratio of 3 females to every 1 male. And you're going to find out the answer on the next slide, so just keep that in mind. But going by that adjusted ratio, we're looking at 600,000 men, but we're looking at 1.8 million women potentially that are coming out. And for the children, we would be looking at a similar ratio of where the number of male children doesn't change, but the number of female children does. But we also have to take into account that when we're looking at the ancient ratios, elders that are over the age of 60, we're not seeing a lot of those in the graves. So it's more like a ratio of 13 to 1 compared to the ratio that we see now of 4 to 1. So that does decrease the amount of elders that are coming out with the Israelites. But this gives us a total of somewhere between 1.9 to 3.5 million people. So we need a beach that is big enough to hold this total of people. And not only are we looking at a beach that can hold this number of people, it's got to hold their animals, the mixed multitude, the Levites, all of the items that they would bring with them, the wagons. So there's a lot of things that are going on. And yes, heaven soon. It's because of the event that we see at the beginning of Exodus where the male children were ordered to be thrown into the river or ordered to be offed before they were barely even old enough to breathe. When we are looking at some of what is called bioarchaeology, some people call it forensic anthropology, we are looking at the ancient bones. Some people call it biological anthropology or physical anthropology. But when we look at the bones of this site in Amarna, we also realize that Amarna is where we see the letters come from later on, where the people in Canaan are asking for the Egyptians' help because of these people that are coming up from the south, the Habaru. So I find it very fitting that this is a study that was done in Amarna. But when we are looking at Amarna, they found that when they're looking at the adult females outnumber the adult males 3.2 to 1, but that all of these bodies show a very significant degenerative joint disease, which means that these individuals lived very hard lives. They were subjected to heavy labor. They had spinal injuries, and it was not a very fun time. There was continual physical stress that would have impacted the lifespan, how these people lived, and also because if you're tired and you're exhausted, it's going to affect your religious life. But just wanted to show where we got those ratios of approximately 3 women for every 1 man. So that is how we would fit. This is the only location along the Gulf of Aqaba that meets the biblical requirements, but that is also big enough to hold that number of individuals. And you can go on Google Maps and you can look at this for yourself. When we are looking at this particular location, we can see here is Nuweibaa Beach. I'm highlighting that with my orange arrow here. This is a study that was done in a journal that was looking at the depth markers and how far down that you could actually go into the Gulf of Aqaba. They found that it actually goes in some places down to over 2,600 feet. Other places, it's very, very shallow. Right next to where Nuweibaa Beach is, there is a very, very, very deep, it's the deepest point in the Gulf of Aqaba. There is another deep point, but in the middle, right across here, it's not so deep. It only goes down to, if you're comparing the colors here, at about a max of 800 meters. And you might say, well, that's quite deep, 800 meters there. But when you look at the underwater elevations, this is an underwater elevation map. The distance, if you went from pretty much the furthest point closest to the mountains that you could get to the other shore, that is about 11 miles or 18 to 19 kilometers. If they left from this point, it would be about 10 miles. So I'm thinking they probably would have left from more along the lines of this area. But we're going to go here just to get some of the largest numbers possible. When you are looking at this map and seeing how far they went, you're like, oh, wow, that's deep. And that would have been a drop of, 1,300 feet and 3,000 feet. And how could they have ever done that? That would have been quite the trip back. But you also have to consider that it wasn't just a steep drop. It was a gradual decline over the course of 18 to 19 kilometers, where they then would have to make their way back up. It wouldn't have been the funnest of adventures, but it is doable, especially over that distance. And if you go and you look at this particular area and you're looking under the sea, you can actually see where there are items that would appear to be chariot wheels, axles. They have found horse hooves in there. There have been studies done where the results of those studies have been sealed. The images that you are looking at on this slide, this is an enhanced image of underwater photo that was taken, and this is an overlay of what it might represent as being underneath of there. Coral does not just randomly grow in this upward shape. It has to have something to attach to. So it would have attached to possibly an overturned chariot axle, grew around the axle. Whether or not the actual axle itself is still in existence, Uh, who knows? But the coral formed a lovely coffin, if you will, or an encasement over what was originally there. So this piece of coral, there might be a broken axle inside of it. This piece of coral may represent a hubcap. We don't know for sure. It is illegal to touch the coral in this area, so you can't actually bring up any to do scientific studies. The best that you can do is actually take photographs, use underwater scanners, use, if you can get GPR units under there or ROVs, to look and see what some of these features are. There have been multiple studies. Some people have not been able to find stuff. Some people have been able. It depends on how deep you go. There was an underwater research association out of a university in Arizona back somewhere around 2011. I personally spoke with one of the researchers that was working on this particular study, and they went down to a depth of about just over 600 feet. And this would have been about 2 miles out into the ocean. And when they were doing these remotely operated vehicle, that's what ROV stands for, when they were doing these studies, they were seeing underneath of all of the sand and the silt when they were doing the scans that there is so much evidence, complete chariots, complete bodies, swords, weaponry. It's all underneath of there. But until you can actually get permission to go in and actually do underwater excavations, you're never going to be able to prove any of this. All that we have to rely on is photos and ROV stats that have been allowed to be released. And this is a very sketchy area to work because of the political tensions in the area. You are talking 2 major countries in a basic war zone. So you're probably not going to get a lot of cooperation to do any scientific studies to prove that an biblical Israelite event occurred at this location. And then if you actually look, at one point there was some physical evidence. So you can see here are the wadis that came down. There was a pillar that was located here at this location, which is why I chose this location to start the measurements from over to the beach. And then there was another pillar on this side that matched it. And we're going to look at those in a moment, but I did want to touch on, was this the crossing? Did they actually have the waters split? Were the waters frozen? What actually happened here? Did a tidal wave pull back all the water so that this whole half the sea over here was exposed? When we are looking at Exodus 14, it states that God divided the sea. Wall of water on the right, wall of water on the left. There was no variation. The waters piled up, and there was walls on both sides. They walked across. It wasn't mush. It wasn't, oh, I'm getting stuck in the sinking sand here. It was a solid road that they could walk on to get through as quickly as possible. And if you were trying to move upwards of 3 million people across an 11-mile stretch of sea during one night with all of their stubborn animals following after them, you'll probably need all night long to get across that stretch of land. So we can see where Exodus 14 clearly states that the waters were divided. It wasn't that the waters, just went back on one side. It was on both sides. And this is also confirmed in Exodus 15 and Nehemiah 9 and Psalms 78 and 106. So we definitely have a lot of evidence in the Bible of multiple individuals, not just Moses, but David and Nehemiah, who were both prophets. And they are all saying the same thing, that the people went through. It was dry land. David says it was dried up like the wilderness, and the wilderness, it's called the desert by some versions. So it was really dry when they went through, and it was walls of water on both sides. So no tidal wave just on one that the water pulled back and then went after they had gotten through and recovered that entire area of the sea. You would be looking for one specific path straight through. Now, getting back to the pillars, this is the pillar that stood on the Egyptian side. It was there, it had been in the water at some point, and so there was a lot of erosion and water wear on it. So you could not read anything on this pillar, but the pillar was still standing. It is believed that King Solomon was actually the one who put these pillars in specifically to mark the site of the Red Sea crossing. But this pillar vanished sometime between March of 2019 and November of 2024. It is completely gone now. Tower is in its place and the pillar is no more. This is the view from the Saudi Arabian side of the sea crossing site. There was a pillar on this side until it was brought to the attention of one of the Saudi princes, whom decided to take it and place it in one of his palaces or someplace where he could view it, and he wanted to protect it. So we don't know where that location is. This sign had been placed where the pillar was to recognize that this was the location where the pillar stood. As far as I am aware, the last time that group went to go to this site to view this post was also missing. But that is kind of hearsay. It might still be there, but the last that I heard from one of the more recent tour groups that went through said that pillar, not the pillar, the pillar's been gone for a while, but this signpost is also missing. So now we finally get back to Mount Sinai. So the Israelites have crossed the sea. They are on their way to Mount Sinai. And the Bible gives an entire list of things that we have to do to determine if this is Mount Sinai. And a lot of people might think, well, she got that idea from Patterns of Evidence because she has mentioned them so many times. I've been doing this checklist for many years, and Patterns of Evidence also is now using this checklist. And it's because the Bible provides all of these details, and it's so easy to use a checklist to say, hey, does it meet these specific qualifications? So it's a good thing to use, and a lot of people use checklists to determine. And we should be grateful for any information that we can find. And when we agree on something, that's fantastic. That shows we're all on the right track. We're all thinking the same way. So first up to be Mount Sinai, it has to be on the other side of the Red Sea crossing. There's no doubt it has to be in the land of Midian. It has to be in Saudi Arabia. There also has to be a cave nearby. There needs to be a split rock somewhere nearby. We need evidence of fire. There needs to be an altar to God. There needs to be a border with pillars. We are also talking an altar to the golden calf because of that whole situation there. There's got to be lots of graves because we have 3 million people. They're there for 2 years. Not only are they there for 2 years, but there was an attack by an enemy nearby, and also the golden calf incident. And then we also need evidence of a very large population. So we've already made one check mark, and that is a location that is in the land of Midian. So now we also have to look at, hey, is there a cave? And we know that there's a cave there because Elijah went there. We can read about this in 1 Kings 19, 8-9, where Elijah came to the mountain of God unto Horeb, and he lodged there. So we need to have a cave. This is also confirmed by Eusebius. He also talks about the mountain of God being Horeb, being in Arabia, and it is Mount Sinai in the desert. Do we have a location in this general vicinity that matches what might be considered a cave? And the answer is yes, we do. Can you spot the cave? So take a moment to look at this wall here and see if you can spot a cave on this wall that leads up to this mountain. So mountain here, it continues down the side, steep slope, and there's a cave somewhere in here. This is what the entrance looks like when you actually go there in person. But can you spot it here? I'm going to reveal it in just a couple of seconds. So look at your screens real close, pinpoint where you think it is, and see if you're right. So we're going to see it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There it is. There is a cave right there that you can walk to. And what's really interesting is that when you're standing in this cave, it's actually, this makes it look a little small, but when you're standing in the cave itself, it's not that small. It's, cozy, and you have a wonderful view. This is the view that is of where all of the Israelites would have been camped at when they're at the base of Mount Sinai. And so Elijah would have been able to see exactly where they had camped, where the golden calf altar had once stood, where the holy precinct was. I mean, that would be quite the view for him to stay at. And he was protected in these rocks. Now, we also have to have a rock where the water came out of, so a split rock. When we read in Exodus 17:6, it says, "Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it." Okay, Moses has his directions. Go to the rock at Horeb, smite it, water's going to come out. But in an area that's absolutely covered with rocks, how do you know which rock is the rock? Because there's a lot of rocks there. You say, is this it? Is this the rock? Is this the rock? But you have to consider there's anywhere between 1.9 and 3.5 million people that are going to need water. So this water can't just be a little itty bitty tiny stream that, might suffice for a wagon train of a couple dozen people. We need some major water source here. How about a rock that stands 60 feet tall, that is on a plateau, that is in the same valley of Mount Sinai, that has a clear split smack dab up the center of it? This one might meet that qualification. So as you can, if you can picture in your mind, the Israelites all encamped out here, and Moses climbing up to this rock and hitting it, and the water just gushing out. There is evidence. Some people claim that it's water evidence, where water erosion occurred. Some people say no, it's weathering. I'll leave that up to you to decide. But there's evidence of what appears to be water and streams and a large lake where the water would have flown into. And you can also see where there are people, just to give you an idea of how big this rock is. This is a person. And over here, this is a person. So this person isn't even as big as my mouse cursor. And this is how big this rock is. So this is a person on the back side of the rock. This is a person in front of the rock. And this is the rock itself. And it meets the qualifications. And if we are looking at a map on where this rock is located, so we see the holy precinct and the area where the cave would have been that faces this direction. And when we're looking at the back half of the mountain, right down here, split rock, right there at Rephidim. and then they would have come over and around in the wilderness of the desert of Sinai, come around this way, and come into the holy precinct here. And then this would be the holy precinct. And with that, let me introduce you to Jebel Makla, which is the burnt mountain, which also sits next to Jebel al-Lawz, which means mountain of the almonds, not mountain of the law. A lot of people think that mountain of the law means that it's literally the laws, the 10 Commandments, but it actually means mountain of the almonds. But that also holds significance because what happened when Aaron's rod budded? Do you know what kind of rod that Aaron had? Give you a minute to think about that, but this is Jebel Makla, and it is what we call Mount Sinai. And now that I've given you a minute to think about it, just want to touch on the fact that Aaron's rod that budded was almonds. So Mountain of the Almonds, Jebel al-Lawz, I wonder if he got his rod from Jebel al-Lawz as they were walking on through. Could be. Now, Mount Sinai was not just any mountain, because it is the mountain that was on fire for God. God came down, the whole mountain looked like it was on fire. It must have looked like a volcano with all of the smoke and the fire, and it was a awesome sight. And by awesome, I mean you were in awe of what was happening there. And when God spoke from this mountain, the people were so afraid. They're like, look, Moses, he has given us the 10 Commandments. We heard him speak, but don't let him speak to us anymore, because we cannot take that. You go up and speak to him and tell us what he says, because we cannot listen to that, because God is such an all-powerful, perfect creature, and we are so imperfect that when we hear God's voice like that, it doesn't matter whether you believe him or whether you don't believe him. You hit your knees. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You must fall to your knees, because you are confronted with the everything. The reason that you exist, the reason that the mountain exists, the reason that the universe exists is God. And this mountain, when we're looking at it, you can see how it is darker on the top. This is not a shadow. So this area here that I've got highlighted for you, this is not a shadow. This is actually where the mountain is burned on the top. And here's another picture, and people will say, oh no, this is a volcanic mountain. So that's why it's burnt on top. These are volcanic rocks. Well, when we look at the rocks that are on this mountain, yes, they are burnt on the top. But when you open them up and when you flip them over, the rocks are not burnt underneath. If they were volcanic rocks, the rocks would have been formed from the lava that then cooled. They would be of a similar color because they're the same material. But these rocks have the same color and texture and makeup of the rocks that are at a lower elevation, the rocks that the rest of the mountain is made from, but on top they are burned, which actually goes to prove that this is actually Mount Sinai. This is not a volcanic mountain. At one point it may have been volcanic, but when these rocks are burned, it was for a totally different purpose. Now, we have hit our 1 hour mark. I think that this is a really good stopping point. So we are actually going to continue our investigation and our checklist into Mount Sinai and all of the evidence that is for this location next week at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 3 p.m. Pacific Time. I hope that you can join me then. If you have any questions about anything that we have talked about today or anything just in general biblical, contact me in the comments box, or feel free to email me or contact me via any of our socials or our website. Be happy to answer those. If it is a question that's not specifically related to this topic, we'll get to it on the Friday night Ask the Archaeologist program that is live every Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern. Look forward to seeing you there. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. Hope that you have a wonderful week, and God bless. Thank you.